What happens when Hollywood's sweetheart walks into what she thinks is a routine late-night interview, only to discover the host has prepared an ambush that will leave her reputation hanging by a thread. Tonight, we're diving deep into the most shocking celebrity meltdown ever caught on live television, where Margot Robbie faced off against Jimmy Kimmel in a battle that nobody saw coming. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what happened next. The Jimmy Kimmel Live studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Cameras were being adjusted. The audience was settling into their seats, and backstage, Margot Robbie was getting her final touch-ups from the makeup team. She had been looking forward to this appearance, especially since she was promoting her latest passion project, a film that tackled serious social issues while still maintaining her signature charm and wit. What she didn't know was that Jimmy Kimmel had spent the better part of the week preparing what he considered to be comedy gold, a series of questions and segments designed to catch her completely off guard. "Margot, you're up in 30 seconds, the stage manager announced, and she flashed her million-dollar smile, straightening her elegant black dress as she prepared to walk out to the familiar sound of applause. The audience erupted as she made her entrance, waving graciously and taking her seat across from Jimmy, who was grinning in that particular way that should have been her first warning sign. "Margot Robbie, everybody," Jimmy announced to thunderous applause. "Thank you so much for being here tonight. You look absolutely stunning as always." His tone was warm, but there was something underneath. Something that made Margot's media-trained instincts twitch just slightly. "Thank you for having me, Jimmy. I'm excited to be here," she replied, crossing her legs and settling back into the guest chair, completely unaware that she was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. "So, your new movie is getting a lot of buzz," Jimmy began, and Margot's face lit up, ready to discuss the project she had poured her heart into. "But before we talk about that, I have to ask you about something that I think our audience is really curious about. There have been some interesting rumors floating around Hollywood lately." Margot's smile faltered just a fraction. This wasn't the direction she had expected the interview to take, and her publicist had assured her that Jimmy's team had agreed to focus primarily on the film. "Oh, what kind of rumors?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light while internally preparing for whatever curveball was coming her way. Jimmy leaned forward conspiratorially, as if he was sharing a secret with millions of viewers. "Well, there's been talk about some behind-the-scenes drama on your last few projects. Sources are saying that you've been, let's call it, difficult to work with. Diva-like behavior, demanding special treatment, that sort of thing." The audience fell silent, sensing the shift in energy. Margot's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her composure. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what you're referring to, Jimmy. I've always prided myself on being professional and collaborative on every set I've worked on." "Come on, Margot," Jimmy pressed, his grin widening. "We're all friends here. Surely you can share some juicy details about what really goes on behind the cameras. Our audience loves that kind of insider stuff." He gestured to the crowd, some of whom were murmuring uncomfortably. Margot's publicist, watching from the wings, felt her stomach drop. This was not what had been discussed in the pre-interview meeting. Jimmy was clearly going off script, and it was becoming obvious that this was some kind of setup designed to make Margot look bad on national television. "Jimmy, I think there might be some confusion here," Margot said, her voice still controlled, but with a slight edge creeping in. "I came here tonight to talk about my new film, which addresses some really important social issues. Maybe we could focus on that instead of addressing baseless gossip." But Jimmy wasn't backing down. If anything, her polite deflection seemed to encourage him. "Oh, but the gossip is so much more interesting than another boring movie interview, don't you think?" He turned to the audience with an exaggerated expression. "I mean, we can always watch the movie later, but right now we have the real Margot Robbie here, and I want to know what she's really like when the cameras aren't rolling." The audience was clearly uncomfortable now, many of them shifting in their seats. This wasn't the playful celebrity banter they had come to expect from Jimmy Kimmel Live. This felt mean-spirited, almost predatory in the way Jimmy was pursuing a line of questioning that was obviously making his guest uncomfortable. Margot took a deep breath, her media training kicking into high gear. "Jimmy, I'm not sure who your sources are, but I can assure you that anyone who has actually worked with me would tell you a very different story. I believe in treating everyone on set with respect and professionalism, from the director to the craft services team." "That's a very diplomatic answer," Jimmy replied, his tone dripping with mock appreciation. "But I have to tell you, some of the stories I've heard are pretty wild." There's this one about you having an assistant fired because they brought you the wrong kind of coffee. Want to comment on that? Margot's eyes flashed, and for the first time since sitting down, her carefully maintained composure began to crack. That is absolutely not true, Jimmy. I don't know where you're getting this information, but it's completely fabricated. Are you calling my sources liars? Jimmy asked, leaning back in his chair with satisfaction. He was clearly enjoying watching her squirm, and it was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone in the studio that this was less of an interview and more of an interrogation designed to humiliate his guest. I'm saying that whoever told you these stories either has me confused with someone else or they have their own agenda, Margot replied, her voice growing stronger as her anger began to override her shock. And frankly, Jimmy, I'm starting to wonder what your agenda is here tonight. The audience was dead silent now, all of them sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Jimmy Kimmel had built his career on being the likable, goofy guy who made celebrities feel comfortable enough to let their guard down and have fun. This aggressive, almost hostile approach was completely out of character, and it was making everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable. My agenda is to entertain our audience, Jimmy said, spreading his hands innocently. And I think they're finding this pretty entertaining, aren't you? He looked out at the crowd, but instead of the laughter and applause he expected, he was met with scattered, nervous murmurs and several people shaking their heads. Margot followed his gaze to the audience, and she could see the discomfort on their faces. These people had come to see a fun, lighthearted talk show, not watch a host systematically try to tear down his guest's reputation on live television. The realization that Jimmy was using her as some kind of sacrificial lamb for his entertainment was the final straw. You know what, Jimmy? She said, her voice now carrying a steel edge that made the host's confident grin waver slightly. I think your audience deserves better than this kind of tabloid trash masquerading as entertainment. They came here tonight expecting to see actual conversation, not whatever this ambush is supposed to be. Jimmy's smile finally cracked, replaced by something much more defensive. Hey now, Margot, I'm just doing my job here. This is what late-night television is all about. Asking the questions that everyone wants to know the answers to. Is it though? Margot shot back, turning in her chair to face him more directly. Because I'm pretty sure your job is supposed to be entertaining people, not spreading lies about your guests. Tell me, Jimmy, exactly who are these mysterious sources of yours? Do they have names, or are we just supposed to take your word for it? The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not expecting her to push back this hard. Well, you know how it is in Hollywood. People don't always want to go on the record when they're talking about someone as powerful as you are. Powerful? Margot let out a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. Jimmy, are you seriously trying to paint me as some kind of Hollywood villain who intimidates people into silence? That's rich, especially coming from someone who clearly ambushed his guest with fabricated stories on live television. The audience was now fully engaged, but not in the way Jimmy had hoped. They were watching a masterclass in someone defending themselves against a bully, and their sympathies were clearly shifting toward Margot. Several people in the front row were actually shaking their heads at Jimmy's behavior. Look, I'm just trying to have some fun here, Jimmy said, attempting to regain control of the situation with his trademark boyish charm. Can't we all just relax and have a good time? Fun. Margot's voice rose slightly, her Australian accent becoming more pronounced as her anger grew. Jimmy, you think it's fun to invite someone onto your show under false pretenses, and then try to destroy their reputation with made-up stories? You think your audience finds it entertaining to watch you bully a guest who came here in good faith? I'm not bullying anyone, Jimmy protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm just asking questions that I thought might lead to some interesting conversation. Interesting conversation would be asking me about my craft, about the messages in my new film, about the causes I support. Margot fired back. What you're doing is tabloid journalism at its worst, and frankly, I expected better from someone with your platform and influence. Jimmy's face was starting to redden, and it was becoming clear that he had seriously underestimated his guest. You know what, Margot? Maybe you're being a little too sensitive here. This is comedy. This is entertainment. If you can't handle a few tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing press. The moment those words left his mouth, the entire atmosphere in the studio changed. Even the crew members visible in the background were exchanging uncomfortable glances. Jimmy had just crossed a line that everyone in the room recognized, and Margot's expression went from angry to absolutely livid. Too sensitive? She repeated, her voice deadly quiet. Now, Jimmy, let me explain something to you about sensitivity. I've been working in this industry for over a decade. I've handled tough questions from legitimate journalists about challenging roles, controversial topics, and yes, even personal matters when they were relevant to my work. But what you're doing isn't journalism. It's character assassination. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his face. You want to know what's really interesting, Jimmy? The fact that you thought you could invite me onto your show, lie to my team about the content of the interview, and then try to humiliate me on national television for your own amusement. That says a lot more about your character than any fictional story about coffee orders says about mine. Jimmy was clearly scrambling now, his usual quick wit apparently abandoning him when faced with a guest who wasn't willing to play along with his game. I never lied to anyone about anything. We're just having a conversation here. A conversation? Margot's laugh was sharp. Jimmy, conversations involve mutual respect and good faith participation from both parties. What you've been doing is more like an interrogation based on gossip and innuendo. And the worst part is you're doing it to someone who came here to support a project that actually matters. She turned to address the audience directly, something that clearly made Jimmy nervous. You know what this film is about? It's about standing up to bullies. It's about people who abuse their power and platform to tear others down instead of building them up. And sitting here right now, I'm getting a pretty clear demonstration of exactly the kind of behavior the movie is trying to address. The audience was hanging on every word now, and several people actually started applauding. Jimmy looked panicked, realizing that he was completely losing control of his own show. Margot, I think you're really overreacting here, he said, trying to sound reasonable, but coming across as condescending instead. This is just how these interviews work. We have some fun. We joke around. We give the audience what they want to see. What they want to see. Margot gestured toward the crowd. Look at them, Jimmy. Do they look like they're having fun? Do they look like they're enjoying watching you try to tear me down with lies and gossip? Because from where I'm sitting, they look pretty uncomfortable with your idea of entertainment. Jimmy glanced nervously. Margot looked at the audience and realized she was absolutely right. The energy in the room had completely shifted, and he was no longer the beloved host having a playful chat with a movie star. He had become the villain in his own show, and everyone in the studio could feel it. I just thought, our viewers like to see the real person behind the celebrity image, he said weakly, grasping for any justification that might salvage the situation. The real person? Margot's voice was incredulous. Jimmy, if you wanted to see the real person, you could have asked me about my passion for environmental causes, my work with various charities, my experience as a producer trying to get more female-driven stories made in Hollywood. Instead, you chose to base your questions on made-up stories designed to make me look like a monster. She stood up from her chair, and Jimmy looked genuinely alarmed. You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy? You had a platform tonight to have a meaningful conversation about art, about storytelling, about using entertainment to make the world a little bit better. Instead, you chose to use that platform to spread lies and try to humiliate someone who trusted you enough to come on your show. Margot, please, let's just take a breath here, Jimmy said, half rising from his own chair. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot, but we can turn this around. Turn this around? Margot's eyes flashed. Jimmy, you don't get to ambush someone with lies and then ask them to pretend it never happened. You don't get to try to destroy someone's reputation and then act like it was all just a misunderstanding when they fight back. The studio was so quiet now that you could hear the hum of the cameras. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, and Jimmy was clearly running out of options. His usual bag of tricks, the self-deprecating humor and boyish charm that had carried him through 15 years of late-night television, were completely useless against someone who had seen through his game and refused to play along. You want to know what's really disappointing, Jimmy? Margot continued, her voice carrying across the silent studio with crystal clarity. I actually used to respect you. I thought you were one of the good ones in this business. Someone who understood that with great platform comes great responsibility. But tonight, you've shown me exactly who you really are. Jimmy was sweating now, his makeup starting to show the stress of the situation. Margot, I think you're taking this way too seriously. This is television. This is show business. Sometimes we have to push boundaries to create compelling content. Compelling content? Margot's voice was filled with disgust. Jimmy, there's a difference between pushing boundaries and pushing people. There's a difference between creating compelling television and creating a hostile work environment for your guests. What you've done tonight isn't boundary pushing. It's bullying, plain and simple. She began walking toward the edge of the interview area, and Jimmy actually stood up, clearly panicking about losing complete control of the situation. Wait, Margot, where are you going? We're not done with the interview yet. Margot turned back to face him, and her expression was one of complete contempt. Oh, but we are done, Jimmy. We're absolutely done because I refuse to sit here and let you continue this charade where you pretend to be the victim of my overreaction when you're the one who orchestrated this entire disaster. I didn't orchestrate anything, Jimmy protested, but his voice was getting higher and more desperate. I was just trying to make good television. Good television? Margot laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Jimmy, good television would have been letting me talk about the film I'm passionate about, the causes I support, the work I'm proud of. Good television would have been treating me with the same respect you'd want to be treated with if you were a guest on someone else's show. She turned to address the audience one final time, her voice strong and clear. You know what, everyone? I want you to remember this moment. Remember what it looks like when someone abuses their power and platform. Remember what it sounds like when someone tries to justify bullying by calling it entertainment. And remember that you don't have to accept it, even when it comes from someone who's supposed to be on your side. The audience was completely silent, but many of them were nodding in agreement. Jimmy looked around desperately, realizing that he had lost not just his guest, but his entire audience as well. Margot, please, he said, his voice now openly pleading. Let's just sit down and have a real conversation. We can start over. We can talk about your movie. We can do this right. Margot shook her head slowly. Jimmy, you had your chance to do this right. You had multiple chances. Every time I tried to redirect this conversation towards something meaningful, you doubled down on the gossip and the lies. You made your choice about what kind of host you wanted to be tonight. I made a mistake, Jimmy admitted. And for the first time since the interview began, he sounded genuinely contrite. I got carried away. I pushed too hard. But we can fix this. No, Jimmy. We can't fix this, Margot replied firmly. Because this wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate choice you made to try to humiliate me on national television. You came into this interview with a plan to make me look bad. And when that plan backfired, you tried to gaslight me into thinking I was overreacting. She walked closer to his desk, her presence commanding the entire studio. You want to know what a real mistake looks like, Jimmy? A real mistake is accidentally asking a question that makes someone uncomfortable, and then immediately apologizing and changing course. What you did was systematic, deliberate, and cruel. Jimmy was completely deflated now. All of his bluster and false confidence evaporated. I never meant for it to go this far. But it did go this far, didn't it? Margot's voice was relentless. And the only reason you're backing down now is because your audience can see exactly what you're doing. If they were laughing along with your little game, you'd still be pushing those fake stories and trying to make me look like a villain. She took off her microphone and set it down on his desk with a sharp click that echoed through the silent studio. You know what the saddest part of all this is, Jimmy? You had a chance tonight to be part of something positive. My film deals with exactly this kind of behavior. People who abuse their power to tear others down. You could have been an ally in that conversation. Instead, you chose to become the perfect example of everything the movie is fighting against. Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Margot, I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry. Can we please just talk about this like adults? Margot paused at the edge of the stage area and looked back at him with something that might have been pity. Jimmy, we are talking about this like adults. The difference is I'm acting like an adult who has self-respect and boundaries while you're acting like an adult who thinks an apology erases the consequences of deliberate harmful actions. So what happens now? Jimmy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now. Margot smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Now you get to sit here and explain to your audience why your guest walked off your show. You get to figure out how to fill the rest of your airtime after you drove away the person you invited here to entertain your viewers. And you get to live with the knowledge that you had Margot Robbie on your show, and instead of creating something memorable and positive, you created this. She gestured to the stunned silence of the studio, the uncomfortable faces in the audience, the visible tension among the crew members who were still trying to figure out whether they should keep rolling or cut to commercial. I hope it was worth it, Jimmy, she said, her voice carrying a finality that made it clear this conversation was over. I hope whatever you thought you were going to gain from this little stunt was worth burning every bridge and showing everyone exactly who you really are when you think you have all the power in the room. With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking authoritatively on the studio floor. Jimmy called after her one more time, his voice cracking with desperation. "Margot, wait. Please don't do this." She stopped without turning around. "Jimmy, I already did it. The question now is what you're going to do next. Are you going to learn from this? Or are you going to spend the rest of your career wondering why guests stopped trusting you enough to be vulnerable on your show?" And with that final devastating question hanging in the air, Margot Robbie walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage, leaving behind a host who had just learned the hardest possible lesson about the difference between entertainment and exploitation. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of Jimmy's humiliation as he sat alone at his desk, facing an audience that had just watched him destroy his own credibility in real time. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Jimmy finally managed to stammer. We'll be right back after this commercial break." But by then, everyone in that studio knew that Jimmy Kimmel Live would never quite be the same again. So there you have it, the most explosive celebrity interview meltdown ever caught on camera. What did you think of Margot Robbie's response to Jimmy Kimmel's ambush? Did she handle it the right way, or should she have tried to diffuse the situation differently? Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you would have done if you were in her position.